Welcome to today's OutMatch Insights webinar, and thank you so much for joining us as we talk about the perfect hiring process. Sorry about that. Hello, my name is Dan House, and I am the marketing manager here at OutMatch. It's my pleasure to be serving as your moderator during this hour. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn and Twitter, and don't forget to join OutMatch on Twitter at OutMatchHCM. And tweet questions, thoughts, or quotes as you're listening by using the hashtag OutMatchInsights. Briefly, before we begin, I'd like to give a quick overview of how we'll spend our time together today. The featured presentation will take approximately 45 minutes, and following that, we'll have some time set aside for a quick question and answer session with our presenters. If you'd like a copy of today's slides, please email your request to info@outmatch.com. If you look at your GoToWebinar status window, you'll see questions queue where you can interact with us during the presentation by asking your questions, making comments, or even sharing best practices at any point during the webcast. We'll answer all questions at the end of the webcast during the Q&A session. You can also tweet your questions or comments to @OutMatchHCM with the hashtag OutMatchInsights. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's featured speakers, Vincent Smith and Andrew D'Agostino. Vincent is the Director of Corporate Development at OutMatch. His career with talent acquisition dates back to the late 90s, and for the past 20 years, he's worked with global companies on talent acquisition strategies. Vince has a deep understanding of the issues and challenges that surround talent acquisition. Joining him today is Andrew D'Agostino, the Director of Product Management at OutMatch as well.
Hi everyone, this is Vincent Smith. I'd like to personally introduce Andrew D'Agostino on the call with us today. He joined us when we were Check.com many years ago, and he's been with us ever since, really ensuring that our science is always sound and leading edge, kind of leading the charge on the research, also helping our customers realize significant returns on our technologies. And of course, now he's graduated into ensuring that our products are as easy to use and beautiful as they are effective and predictive. So welcome, Andrew.
It's quite an introduction. Thanks, Vince. Appreciate it. Happy to be here.
All right. So why don't we just jump right into the presentation today. We're going to talk a little bit about the perfect hiring processes, but let's start really with the hiring process of today and some of the challenges. And look, here's the deal with hiring processes today. They're virtually identical to how they were decades ago. In other words, same steps occur. Somebody applies to a job, goes through a series of steps, and then gets hired. It hasn't really changed. I mean, don't get me wrong. We've made some improvements, and we do have a lot of technologies that have helped us drive efficiency into the process. Keep a lot of that information we gather out of those old filing cabinets. I'm sure a lot of you remember those days. Not fun. But ultimately, the same challenges that we had decades ago still really persist, and we aren't really that much further along in terms of making all this data that we're collecting useful, right? And in fact, we have all this technology collecting candidate data. It's usually siloed, and it's completely disconnected from other parts of our hiring process, right? And so what we want to talk about is what can we do to really improve this and move the ball forward, and really is there a perfect hiring process, right? And when we talk about that, even before we talk about the perfect process, what we have to really think about are a lot of questions about why we do certain things in the hiring process. So we're going to walk through the steps of the perfect hiring process. But before we do that, I would encourage everyone to go through some brainstorming exercises, right? And think of the questions that you should be asking. And questions maybe such as this.
Yeah, and I think when you think about these questions, right, it's really a gap analysis for your own hiring process. And they're hitting a bunch of different areas. I like to think about these challenges and the metrics that we're collecting about our hiring process into different buckets, right? You have efficiency metrics, like time to fill, as the previous slide showed. And you have quality metrics, which are maybe impact upon job performance, You could have sourcing metrics like your candidate experience and how it reflects your recruitment brand. And asking yourself these questions is really a good gap analysis for yourself to do in order to identify areas where you want to focus, right? So in doing this exercise, it's nice to first ask yourself the questions relative, do you think that you have a good hiring process? And go through, is my process too long? How's my candidate experience? And then go through it a second time, asking yourself, okay, now, how does it compare to other people in my industry or other companies, really? I think that's really telling because it'll allow you to see gaps in where your competitors for the same talent are, right? And it's good to know this information because if you identify areas where you don't know how long your process is, or if you don't really know what you're measuring in your hiring process, that's also useful to know as well.
So the first thing we want to do is kind of break down our process into steps, right? There's always steps in a given process, and we want to ask yourselves all of those questions because you need to understand why you're doing any particular step in the process. And when you understand why you're doing it, then you can kind of determine the how to do it that fits in, and then we can measure it and work out the process. But if you can't answer those upfront questions first, then kind of none of this stuff is really going to make an awful lot of sense for you. It's just all going to be sort of in a vacuum. So I just can't stress how important that is. But the first piece of that puzzle, once we understand that, right, is really assessing a candidate's fit for a job. Now, I know that seems obvious, but people send in their resumes or fill out some sort of an application, and we think we're applying some criteria to help us understand if they can do the job. Sometimes it's relevant and sometimes it's not, but if we use job relevant assessments at the very front end, right, that's the beginning piece to help us understand if we should let a candidate in, and it's generally more subjective and useful than things like resumes, things of that nature, right? We need to do interviews, everybody does them. Reference checks will get into why and how to do those. Then ultimately, once you do all these things, we need to be able to measure the outcome of all of the steps in your process and what effect they have.
Yeah, exactly, Vince. I think also, I think you would agree on this, that you have to tie it to, in the middle of this circle, defining job success, right? So you need to make sure that all of these different methods in which you're collecting information about your candidates are actually job relevant. Because if you're not asking questions about what does it take to do this job, then you're introducing noise into your decision making, right? All of a sudden your hiring decision is flooded with information that doesn't actually matter. So it's very important to tie it back to defining job success. And further, you want to make sure all of this information is not siloed, right? So you want to make sure that information in what you're collecting feeds throughout the process, and that you're making a holistic judgment about all the data that you collected in your hiring process. So those are really key to understanding.
Cool. Okay.
So let's go ahead and take a quick poll. I'm going to launch it right now, and you can interact with it and select what pieces you feel are most important to you to improve in your own hiring process. And we'll take a few minutes for everybody to select their answers and kind of talk through these as the selections. When, are you looking to assess candidates early on in the process to find the top talent and fast track it through? Structure your interviews so you can stop doing the casual, unstructured ones. Start to check references, and check references so it's not a waste of your time. Hires into strong leaders, and ultimately gather performance data, and not just at the one-year review, but within the first 90 days. And this will give us a good outlook on what we can spend more time on today and less time on the other things that may not be as important. And we'll close it in about 5 seconds. I think everybody got a chance to get in there. And I'll share the results with everybody. And gentlemen,
sure, let's take a look.
Here it comes.
Gotta love technology.
Any minute now.
So it's telling me that you're all viewing the results. I'll just tell them to you. So 42% are looking to assess candidates from early on in the stage. 16% looking to stop doing the casual, unstructured interview. Only 5% are concerned with the reference checks, wasting their time. 26% is higher than I thought it would be for developing new hires into strong leaders. Good. And we have other webinars that address those issues. And 11% are looking to gather that post-hire performance data within the first 90 days. So that's good. We see that 42%, almost half the audience, is looking to assess their candidates in a better way.
Great, and that's really important because, especially if you're doing this up front in your process, because it really helps to identify fit and potential for fit right away and set that bar for what's a standard to get to the next step in your process. So you can not waste your recruiter's time, right? And you can also make sure that only people getting to the interview are people who have the potential for success, really.
Right. You don't have time to be, in a lot of cases, especially in the high volume hiring, you don't have time to be going through afford everybody an interview, unfortunately. And the fact of the matter is that if you don't have some really good criteria helping you automate that upfront process, then the stats are working totally against you before you even get somebody into the interview process, right? The house is going to win. All right. So let's talk about that first. That first thing is assessing a candidate for job fit. There's a lot of ways to go about that, but we have to know if that person is going to be a good fit for the role that we're considering them for and for our company, and we need to do that in a holistic way. Here's the spoiler. There isn't one instrument, there's not one test, and there certainly isn't one question that's going to help you determine that, right? So we want to look at what kind of components we can layer on top of one another to provide us the insights that we need to really understand job fit. Andrew, you want to talk a little bit about some of the different components that we might want to consider?
Yeah, absolutely. Even before I just jump into this, you really want to just make sure to understand and separate out the method of your hiring process and what you're actually doing during that method. So specifically, an assessment is a way to capture information, but the things that are up here on the screen are what that assessment is measuring, right? And you want to make sure that everything, whether it is your assessment or it's your interview or other pieces, they're all job relevant, right? So these things can be different based on the needs and job demands. So what we have here up on the screen are a couple different types of measurement, if you will, that vary based on what's important for the job. So, personality factors are pretty standard here. Someone's ability to be dependable and conscientious, someone's ability to drive for results, to be ambitious. These are personality traits and differences we see in people that matter a lot on jobs, especially if they're customer-facing jobs as well. Those tend to be high in personality predictiveness. Cognitive ability is one of the strongest actual predictors of job performance across almost all jobs. It's about 24%, around 24-25% of job performance from cognitive ability assessments. And those are really powerful information, and you just want to make sure that if your assessment is including cognitive ability, you're layering personality factors on top of that so that you get a whole well-rounded picture, right? So it's really important to know personality and how someone would interact in a situation, but it's also important to know cognitive ability. How fast are they going to learn? How fast are they going to draw patterns between things? That affects everyone's job performance. And other factors here as well, right? Culture fit, how are they going to do relative to the values that my company holds and that the norms that everyone set up in my organization. And lastly, situational judgment is really important if you want to capture information about different scenarios relative to what the candidate might find themselves on the job. All different factors that can be measured through an assessment.
All right. So, if we're measuring these variables, we can really get a pretty good picture of a candidate's potential for success, right? And if we're only looking at what they've done before on their resume, the best you can do there is really know if a candidate has done similar work before, but you don't really know if they're willing and ready to do the particular job that you're hiring them for. And if you're hiring somebody that's coming in from another organization and is on a career growth path, and the position that you're hiring them for is one step up the ladder, then that previous experience really isn't telling you much about what they're going to do in your position. You got to use job-specific measurements so you can start to put this picture together, really get to know them a little bit better.
And I think, Vince, I think the important thing when I think of assessments, right? So it's more than just the capturing of the picture, right? It's how do you translate that information and make it powerful for your perfect hiring process, right? So you want to make sure that the output of the assessment is delivering a very clear and simple decision-making factor to your recruiters or your hiring manager right up front. They don't have to waste time in trying to interpret everything about a candidate up front. They can go through this process efficiently and get the information all in one simple place.
Yeah, that's key. I mean, as we see in interviewing, we can train all we want to on how to interpret things, but especially in large organizations,
it's got to be scalable.
It's got to be scalable, and that training you can do it all you want, but people across the organization are going to interpret things differently.
Yeah.
That's what makes all this really difficult. And there's also, where technology can really help out.
Absolutely.
So let's actually dive in and take a look at a real-world example from a very well-known company, Chili's, right? Everybody's familiar with Chili's, and they began using some battery of assessments at the very front of their hiring process, and have realized some, I think, pretty remarkable results, right? Not only in reducing overall turnover in previously high turnover positions, but significant revenue increases that came out of that, as well as cost savings. I mean, 3 really, really big criteria that truly define the fact that their hiring process is working really, really well and having significant impacts on their company, right? So, just to kind of give you an example of how this looks in the real world if you're doing it right.
Yeah, I think this is interesting because this is addressing kind of an overlooked factor with assessments, is that you can tune your assessments to predict specific things, right? So as an organization, if you have certain initiatives to drive performance in a certain job, you can tune your assessments to predict for that. And that's really powerful. And to your recruiters and hiring managers, it's just a decision factor, really simple, but there's all this foundation of how this will affect positively on the organization. They don't even have to deal with it. It's simple for them, and all of this comes at the end of the process.
Sure. All right, cool. So, just to take a quick step back up front, we need to put something in place that helps drive efficiency and help our recruiters understand who they should even be spending any sort of time with. It's got to be job relevant, data driven, help them make that decision early on. In most cases, the next step is some form of an interview. This is where real problems begin in virtually all hiring processes, and here's why. The interview is probably the single piece of the hiring process that virtually every company in existence does at some point during the hiring process, right? The interview. It's ubiquitous. It's also one of the elements that holds the most weight in determining a hire or no hire factor, right? So everybody does it. It's the highest weighted thing that we do. It's also the single most error-prone part of any hiring process. And I don't want to underemphasize that, right? Everybody does it, we weight it very highly, and it's the worst part of the process in terms of predicting or getting to a good result because of all the errors that are typically introduced. That really begs the question, you got to think about this, why do we even interview at all? Andrew?
That's a great question. I mean, I think at the end of the day, if you do it right, it can be really effective, right? It can add information that you're not getting at other points of your hiring process. Now, I want to emphasize that when you do it right, because at the same time, it also gives you a chance to see whether you want to work with someone. Right?
And that's critical. Yeah. You have to know that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So when done right, it's good.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about some of the some of the challenges with why interviewing is typically so error-prone. And the first is that we're all human. And because we're all human, we are all susceptible to various biases. This is pretty well researched, pretty well documented these days. However, we find that this is not introduced to wide swaths of large organizations. The fact that this stuff exists, it's real, and everybody kind of succumbs to it. And there's all kinds of different biases that influence the interview when we get to the interview process. And there are things that we can do to overcome that. And it first starts with acknowledging that they exist and being aware of them and being aware of them in ourselves. And of course, the second is use some tools to help make sure that what you're doing is structured and is job relevant and gives you some ability to get job relevant and objective data out of your interviews. But let's talk about the biases first. Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these are known. If you don't know a lot of these, I won't go through them all, but just a high level. We know that everybody makes evaluations about other people. It's just actually human nature, right, to do that. It helps us characterize and categorize people. But it can really be a disadvantage, especially in an interviewing situation. One of the biggest problems with prejudging is really this human attribution bias. So we tend to ignore situational factors and really these contextual factors that may explain why someone's behaving in a certain way, and instead relate those behaviors to that person's personality. Prime example, if you are interviewing a candidate and they're 10 minutes late, we usually make judgments and say that that person is not dependable, they're not reliable. So we're making an attribution about their disposition, but they could have gotten into a car accident on the way over or a flat tire, and that's the reason they're 10 minutes late. And where they may be such a dependable person and reliable, we now have this opinion of them from this bias. Halo is another big one. It's when one factor about a person really colors every other judgment about that person. So if you really connect with a candidate because they're kind and nice in the interview, that's great. You may really like working with them, but it doesn't say anything about their skills or job performance abilities. So we have to be aware of these biases, and we need to insert process to remove this noise from our judgments.
Right. And the reality is that, once again, this kind of goes back to the training that we talked about earlier. You can train all you want, and it makes people aware of this stuff, and that's good. The reality is that humans are still humans, people are still people, and you're never going to train away human behavior. And this is really where technology can come in, into play here. And here's a couple of things that you can do to really help make sure that you're driving a great interview. And there are technologies that exist that kind of wrap this all up in a nice package, so it doesn't become that thorny training issue. So the first and obviously the most common sense, I would think, is make sure that you've done your job analysis and that the questions that you're doing are job relevant and structured, behavioral-based interview questions. Right? Those are proven to be the most effective in terms of getting the right types of data you need to make.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Vince, because it's more than just structuring, right? So structure is super important, but it's about asking the right questions. Okay, so we know that behaviorally based questions about their past experience and how they've overcome a situation, how they felt about it, and whether it was effective is really critical to job performance and is a much better measurement than just asking an open-ended question.
Yeah. And of course, we all know, because we've been keeping up on our literature the past couple of years, that all of the quote-unquote trick questions do not have any relevancy or validity whatsoever. How many golf balls fit in a bus doesn't tell us anything about a candidate's problem-solving abilities. It just doesn't. Look it up. There's a ton of research articles on this. The second part to asking the right question is also to make sure you have some sort of a rating scale or an anchor scale that all interviewers are using in order to help them get away from trying to independently interpret the answers. Maybe the right question is, what's your favorite color? And that's what I asked Dan, and he tells me the answer is blue, and I think that means something particular, and he tells Andrew the color is blue, and he thinks that means something completely different and awful, right? We've asked the right question, but we've got two people that came to completely different conclusions. And so you need to have some sort of an anchor so that you prevent people needing to interpret the answers. Just asking the right question just simply isn't enough, and it doesn't scale across organizations. So you can put out the right questions without those anchors, you're in trouble.
Absolutely.
You also have to make sure you're asking, obviously, all the candidates the same questions. It just provides impartiality and fairness, and make sure you're getting an accurate comparison. Right? And ideally, you do want to have more than one person having conducted an interview with a candidate, so you get multiple points of insight.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So some simple things that you can do, but really the two big key ones here are job relevant behavioral-based questions or structured questions, and make sure you have some sort of an anchor or a rating scheme that everybody's using to keep it consistent. If you do, that actually scales really well across the largest organizations. All right. So we've used criteria in the very front of the hiring process to help drive some efficiencies and help our recruiters stack the deck in their favor towards making that good hire. We've conducted a job relevant structured interview. Now we've got a couple of finalists. It's time to do something that most people overlook, and that's the lowly reference check, right? We understand that it's a painful process, and in fact, in our surveys, only 25% of companies say they have a good process in place to collect information. The other 75% say they either struggle to get more than basic employment data, they can't reach references, or they just don't even do it. So, look, here's the deal. You really should be doing reference checks. At the very least, it helps provide you some layer of protection from negligent hiring. So, check the box at least for that reason alone. However, if done right, there's a ton, and I mean, this is like bang for your buck here, there is a ton of benefits you can derive from this. If done right, you can automate the process completely. There's tools online, automate it, click the button, drives huge time savings into your recruitment team, allow them to do more high-value activity. Right? You can get critical data on whether the candidate really can do the job that you want to do, regardless of how they've done on their previous position. Right? You can capitalize on a great branding opportunity with a captive audience with those references. And of course, you can generate an entire pipeline of new targeted candidates. So if you do this right, if you utilize online tools available today, you can click a button, and in the background, all of these things sort of, I want to say magically happen, but it's pretty, it's pretty awesome. So you really should be doing it to begin with. Yeah, it's a pain, so do it right, utilize technology, realize the benefits.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually love reference checking because I think it is really powerful when done right, and lends a lot of predictability towards your hiring decision and how it affects performance on the job. Because these people are past, are in this candidate's past, and they know a lot about them that you don't know because you haven't worked with them before. So when you collect that information, it's super critical. So I love also the candidate pipeline aspect of reference checking, and it's kind of novel. But when you really think about it, these references can be used as future candidates because a lot of them share sometimes the same job, or they're in the same industry as the candidate themselves. So when you're posting your jobs, you can actually use this as a source. This is one example of how a company did this. So they had an automated reference checking solution that processed over 2,000 references, and a bunch of those references were asked whether they themselves would like to be considered for future employment at that organization. And 22% of them said yes. That's huge. That's a lot of future candidates. And they were checking 4 to 5 references per candidate and getting responses from them. And 45% of those were former supervisors, and then 32% were peers, and they're giving lots of valuable wealth of information towards your hiring decisions. So it's really interesting when you think about your capabilities of turning reference checking on its head, right, and stop considering it a thing that you do after you make an offer, but move it up as a thing that you can use to make your final hiring decision.
You're getting, if you ask the right questions of the candidates, they're going to be job relevant and competency based, and you're going to get some amazing feedback. For our clients, we actually see a bell curve. We get, candidates get a score on this, and we actually see a bell curve. And look, between 10 and 15% of all references don't get a good score.
Yeah, which essentially means that candidates are getting through your assessment and your interview and still can be screened out because they are not fit ultimately as a top performer for you.
They don't have the competencies required for the job that you need them to do.
And that's why you need that holistic picture.
Holistic picture, right. So let's take a look, one more quick example of how this, just once again, an outcome of clicking the button and doing this the right way. Not only that predictive data, but that talent pool. Group M, they were actually able to, just using this piece of the puzzle, significantly reduce their time to fill. As a matter of fact, people that scored really, really highly, they have an alternate hiring process for them. They call it fast track, right? They avoid bad hires. They were able to generate a tremendous increase in their sourcing pipeline, over 6,000 candidates that came into their pipeline over 2 years that they never knew existed before, simply by matter of utilizing this process, right? So reference checking, when you do it by phone, it's a pain and it is utterly worthless and it's a time suck, so don't do it. But if you do it right, you can get an unbelievable number of benefits that touch on a lot of areas. So it's a critical piece of your perfect hiring process. So let's move on to what I think is probably even more important than all of this, and it's the critical piece lacking today in virtually every organization that we see out there. And that's what happens after we make that hire. We did all of these things. We put a process together, perfect, imperfect, or otherwise. We wound up at a hiring decision, and then it stops, right? The candidate is now a new hire. They go into a different system. Maybe they go into a performance management system, but we have nothing tying back to all of those pieces of our hiring process to say, was our hiring process efficient? Was it effective? Did it work the way we wanted it to? And did it have an outcome that's positive to our company, right? And so the most important thing you can really do to make your hiring process truly perfect is actually after hire, and that's measuring the outcome.
And it's just basics, right? It's the feedback loop. It's how do you improve your process if you don't know, and what happens afterwards?
How do you even know if it's working?
Yeah, exactly. Yep. And it's not enough to just look at how efficient it is, right? You need to know that quality aspect, and you can only collect that quality information after the fact, after the hire's made.
Right. So a lot of ways to go about this. You don't want to just rely on performance management because that really doesn't tie the loop. It certainly doesn't tie back to the tools and the processes and the criteria that you use to make that hire to begin with, and it's generally too late.
Well, why can't you do that, I guess is my question. So why can't you use that information?
You probably could use it, but once again, typical performance management generally kicks in somewhere in the 12 to 18 month post-hire.
Right, okay, so they're not even, they're very gone at that point. I would imagine too that the systems being different can be cause logistical problems.
We have that siloed data, so we have criteria that we use at different stages of the hiring process, at the assessment stage, at the interview stage, and at the reference check stage, and those are almost never tied back to performance management. And if they had it, if the criteria that you used actually influenced that person's performance, that's the biggest problem. But the reality is there are tools that we can put in place to find out, and you want to find this out relatively near term after hire, depending on the job, and every job is different. But there are tools we can put in play to understand whether our processes and our tools are quality and are producing some kind of effect. Think of it as understanding if we actually did make that term quality of hire, right? You can't know that at the time of hire. You can only know that after that person has performed on the job, but we want to link that back to your hiring process.
Yeah, and I think, this is an interesting system because it creates a feedback loop kind of closed in to the hiring process, which I think is really important because you can gather information to your selection decision rather than way out 18 months later when so many other factors are involved in that person's performance, right? So I think what's nice about this is you hire the candidate, and who's now the new hire, right? And they go through a training process, presumably, and they start performing on the job. Once they're ramped up, you check in with that candidate, or that new hire now, and you gather some information about how's everything going, how engaged are you, right? So, and how was the recruitment process now that you're on the job? And then you can at the same time capture information from that new hire's manager about that new hire, right? So how are they performing? They're 90 days, 100 days in. Let's do a check-in. And you can use that information to be automatically fed back to your hiring process. And I would think that you can use that information to then iterate your hiring process and learn from it. So if you know that the assessment, for example, is not doing as great a job at predicting performance because these new hires are not receiving good performance scores, you can use that information to make the assessment better. And you can look at analytics and data from this that you can collect from here to help improve the hiring process overall. So I think this is a really neat system.
Yeah. Well, also, if you do this right and you start to collect this information both from that new hire and from the hiring, the managers or the supervisors, and from multiple people, it starts to tell a story that's almost more business intelligence than it is just
absolutely,
just talent acquisition. It's information that you can start to bring back to your executives to say, hey, we invested $4 million this year. Here's actually what happened, and then here are the things that we tweaked because we learned along the way.
That's tying to the bottom line. Right? And I think the trick is, right, when you put this in operation is it should be automated, right? We don't want to have this be a manual process, and it's got to be short, right? There's a lot of new hires, and the information you're collecting, you just want to be super targeted about it, not make this a burden for that new person.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the way we look at it tends to be trying to measure the candidate experience, whether once that person is on the job, whether the job matches kind of the story that they were told beforehand. How often do we see, selection tools and selection processes get high performers in the job but then leave, and then we identify that the job that they went into was very different than the job promised, or the job changed, something changed, and all of a sudden the stats start to change in terms of who stays and who leaves. And it's easy to say, oh, it's the hiring process is not working right, and then you say, well, if we look at everything, we can identify time frames when changes occurred. We can say, did something happen on that date? And oh yeah, we changed our onboarding, or we changed our benefits, or the training changed. You can start to look holistically at everything going on in your process, even post-hire, and understand exactly which pieces of the puzzle are influencing your outcomes today, and adjust those as necessary. I mean, just insight you've never been available before.
Yeah, absolutely.
Not only where most of our candidates are coming from, but where are the candidates coming from that had the biggest impact on our company. Those are far more valuable. Do we have some recruiters that are doing a better job of hiring people that stay longer and do better? Do we have recruiters who are falling flat and hiring a ton of people that need to get replaced? I mean, it goes on and on and on. But when you start to put this post-hire measurement in place, the stories that come out start to become very, very powerful. And this is actually, some really, really cool stuff.
Great.
So, we don't want to take up too much time, but let's just go through a quick summary here. the perfect hiring process. Start with making things job relevant and making sure that whatever you're doing up front is assessing that candidate to job fit. At the very, very early stages, drive some efficiency in there. Don't leave that up to a human. Utilize technology. It's available. It's super simple to use, and it provides better outcomes. Right?
Yeah, and if I may, Vince, like really separating that what from the why from the how. So you want to measure personality, which is the what, and you're doing it the why because it's predictive. And you're measuring that through an assessment, which is the how. And so think about those things throughout your whole process, separating the what, why, and how.
Yeah. And if you put it in place correctly, the reality is stuff speeds up hiring processes. It doesn't actually slow it down. What slows stuff down is having things be unstructured and subjective.
Yeah.
Right? And actually, before even any of this, to go back to what we said earlier, ask questions about your own hiring process.
For sure.
I'd start there. You're going to do an interview. I sort of tongue-in-cheek asked, why do we even do interviews? But there are really good reasons to do them. We just have to be aware of the very common failure points in an interview. Make sure that that we structure the interview in a manner to get rid of those errors and make it simple. Look, you need to find out on a human-to-human basis if you like the person, you can work with them, and they're going to get along with your team. That's without a doubt. But you really need to understand if they can do the job that you want to hire them to do, and traditionally interviewing has been the single worst way to identify that, but there are ways to do that better. Reference checking, look, you should be doing it anyways. It is a giant time suck and you get terrible information unless you do it right, and then it actually saves a ton of time and provides all these downstream benefits. It actually can be one of the single most cost-effective and easy-to-use weapons in your arsenal. You can use all this data. If you do a really great perfect hiring process, you can use all this data to help you develop your talent too. So don't lose sight of the fact that you've gathered some really critical information that you can use for coaching and development. And then I would argue the single most important piece of the perfect hiring process is measuring the outcome. If you don't do that, we can't ever really know if it's perfect up front. We can't continuously improve, and we can't make it better. And you're going to have a hard time going back to your executives being able to quantify all that technology, tools, and processes that you just put in place. So, if we were to sum up the perfect hiring process, obviously it's not one size fits all. It's fairly generic. But there are things that we can do to make this really data-driven, really simple, super efficient, capture data post-hire so you can refine it and make it better as we go.
Absolutely.
All right, cool. Well, that was a wealth of information. There are a few questions that came in. So I'll ask them to the two of you, and if you want to discuss the answer, or if one of you want to take them each, it really doesn't matter. But I think the most important one that came through, we talked about reference checking, and the question is about liability in reference checking when somebody, so the specific question is there any legal liability that we have when performing a reference check? Yeah, so this is one of the most kind of misunderstood areas out there. Technically, there is no liability unless you, except for libel and slander, so as long as you don't cross those lines. If you're talking about being a reference, those are the lines you have to watch out for. That applies to everybody anytime, not just reference checking. And as far as a company conducting reference checks, once again, job relevance tends to be the key. If it's job relevant, then no, there are no, there aren't any legal issues with that. Great. We have another one here about the interview, and it's more of a specific question to, what type of question would you ask to gain insight on a candidate's personality?
Well, so I would separate it from personality. People are often horrible judges of other people's personality because of all those biases. But I would, you want to make it job relevant, right? So tapping into a different knowledge, skill, or ability they need to do, or you can make it a specific you're trying to get at, right? Like driving results or, competency that you would see, integrity, right? But the best thing to do is make a behaviorally based interview question. Those have been shown to be the most effective, and that is simply a question that asks about a situation that this candidate has faced in their past. So tell me about a time when.
Right, and a situation that they have experienced, not what would they do.
Those are situational interview questions, which are good, but not as good, right? So if you can't make behavioral, go situational, but behavioral are the best. So tell me about a time when blah, 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 and what was the situation, what was the outcome, and were you happy with the desired result? And so you can get a number of factors from just one question, just like that. So if you start to throw in some behaviorally based questions that are tied to the actual job, you really make your interview much more effective. Yeah.
Perfect. And then one last question. Is there a specific length on how long an assessment should be?
As long as necessary to get to a predictive result for a given job.
Well, yeah, I think it's interesting because you have a couple of factors in play when you're talking about length of assessment.
I think this gets that candidate experience a little bit more than anything else, right?
Absolutely. So you actually, as an organization employing an assessment, you need to make a trade-off decision, right? Because if you go with a really short assessment, guess what? You're asking less questions and you're measuring less about that person, which means that the predictive ability of that assessment has been lowered, right? So you need to make that decision when facing how long my assessment should be. I think that around 10, 12 minutes for like an hourly role is really sufficient. You can gather a lot of information. We're seeing assessments that are coming out that are knocking down the time from like really cool technology that they're deploying, which I think is awesome. I'm really loving the new assessments coming out. But you want to make sure that those are giving you a lot of prediction, right? It's not just about the shortness of it. So yeah, I think it depends, and it's job relevant, right? So a managerial role where the impact of that hire is great. You don't want to give them a 5-10 minute assessment and call it quick. Like that impact of that person is huge. You want to know a lot about them.
I mean, and I would say, it also depends, right? If you're getting 2% more predictive by doubling the length of the assessment,
yeah,
then probably may not be worth it.
Sure, absolutely, yep.
Great. Well, we've wrapped up our material for today, but feel free to continue the discussion on Twitter at OutMatchHCM with the hashtag OutMatchInsights. I'd like to say thanks one more time to our speakers, Vincent Smith and Andrew D'Agostino. This has been an OutMatch Insights webinar. We appreciate you taking the time out of your busy day and spending it with us, and we look forward to seeing you on another webinar soon, which will be November 10th. Questions can go to info@outmatch.com, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.